Hello, everyone, and good afternoon from New York. I need to remind our virtual audience that this webinar is being recorded. And I'm Catherine Heinz, Executive Director of New York City Audubon. It's national conservation leader, of which New York City Audubon is a large urban chapter. We are one of more than 450 Audubon chapters across the country and one of about 24 staff chapters that actively conserve birds in urban communities. You may know that cities like New York with clearly delineated parks are fantastic for bird watching when the birds mass together in our green spaces during migration. We have a lot of buildings, and in a perfect storm of sorts during peak migration, we sometimes see mass collision bird mortality events like the one last week that attracted national media coverage. It's heartbreaking, but it's a teachable moment for public engagement, and you can help. Our community science reporting tool called dBird records dead and injured birds where they occur. dBird works everywhere, and we encourage all of you to use it. When you find a dead or injured bird anywhere, go to dbird.org on your phone. It takes about 30 seconds to log what you found, and the data supports ongoing advocacy efforts to increase awareness of bird building collisions and change public policy to save birds. Now, dense built environments like New York City, located in the path of migrating birds, are dangerous for those birds. Collisions with glass, exacerbated by artificial light at night, are not just urban threats, however. They are threats to birds everywhere, urban, suburban, and rural, anywhere there are windows. Climate change further exacerbates this human-built problem by bringing more intense and changeable weather, which can alter bird migration patterns. Audubon's Climate by Degrees report 2 years ago showed that climate change is the #1 threat to birds. Climate change also threatens people, and our fates are intertwined. We are called to action. The good news is that Audubon is everywhere, and it is leading the national conservation conversation for birds, and it is nimbly able to adapt this conversation to suit the needs of our diverse communities, urban, suburban, and rural, local, regional, national, and yes, international. It is therefore my great pleasure to welcome you here to this program, which is part of Climate Week NYC, a series of events held in New York annually to coincide with the UN General Assembly, purposefully to amplify discussion around global climate change solutions. So without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Gray, Acting CEO of the National Audubon Society.
Thank you, Catherine, for that welcome and introduction. We are thrilled to have you here with us today. I want to commend New York City Audubon staff and members for all the work that you do on behalf of our mission. As you mentioned, climate impacts are everywhere, including affecting the migratory patterns of birds. And so when birds pass through densely populated areas like New York City, we do have the potential for these deadly building strikes that you mentioned, which New York City Audubon has done a great job of tracking and monitoring. We are so grateful for your advocacy efforts to protect birds as they move through our cities and to restore and protect coastal habitats that are threatened by rising sea levels, which also benefit migratory shore birds, coastal birds, beach nesting birds, colonial water birds, horseshoe crabs, and forage fish. We are always grateful to partner with one of our 450 chapters to elevate the issues that are important to birds, including climate change, from New York to California to Alaska and in between. As Catherine said, my name is Elizabeth Gray, and I am the acting CEO of the National Audubon Society. I'm glad to be with you all here today to talk about climate, the greatest existential threat to our world. For those of you who don't know, Audubon is a 116-year-old organization dedicated to protecting birds in the places they need today and tomorrow. And we do our work through science, advocacy, education, and on-the-ground conservation. For years, we've worked on policies promoting things like bird-safe buildings and lights out and land and water conservation. Over the past decade, we've also expanded our work to address the #1 threat to birds and their habitats: climate change. Birds, of course, are everywhere. And so by studying how climate affects them, we can also learn a lot about how it's affecting us as well. The National Audubon Society works on climate across landscapes in different ways with our state and regional offices, our chapters, and our local partners, and on the ground with public and private landowners, as well as on policy at our local, state, and federal levels. We know that climate change is a complex problem that's going to require robust solutions. And that's why we at the National Audubon Society work on both climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And we do this in partnership with Audubon's more than 1.8 million grassroots members. Together, we've championed clean energy legislation in the halls of Congress and in many states, including some that you might find surprising, like Arkansas and South Carolina. In fact, today, Audubon staff and volunteer leaders are meeting with members of Congress on some of our top issues, including programs that help restore ecosystems and promote natural infrastructure, which are nature-based approaches for building resilience to climate impacts. We are hopeful that the dedicated funding and the new policies that come out of our bipartisan infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill that are currently being debated in Congress will meaningfully move this country towards a cleaner and a more sustainable future. Natural infrastructure is engineering with nature, basically protecting, restoring, and mimicking natural ecosystems like wetlands and oyster reefs to reduce the risk of natural hazards in communities while also delivering multiple benefits. Natural infrastructure provides important habitat for birds that we all care about. And these systems also provide natural buffers for communities who are being ravaged by the impacts of climate change, flooding, drought, and wildfires, to name just a few. In 2014 and 2019, our scientists issued reports that made it clear. Birds are telling us it's time to take action on climate. Our 2019 climate report, Survival by Degrees, showed that 2/3 of North American bird species are at risk of extinction from climate change. The good news is that our science also shows us that if we take action now, we can help improve the chances for survival of 76% of species at risk. Our most recent report, which was just published this summer, found that many regions that provide critical habitat for birds are also excellent at storing carbon or removing carbon from the atmosphere. And this means that restoring and maintaining places that both naturally store carbon and provide habitat for birds is a win-win. Ongoing conservation and restoration of these natural climate solutions identified in our report could deliver up to 1/4 of the US commitment to draw down greenhouse gas emissions in the 2016 Paris Agreement. That's why I care about climate, and that's why Audubon does too. I started my career studying homing pigeon navigation as an undergraduate, and then spent some time in Eastern Washington State studying red-winged and yellow-headed blackbirds for my doctoral thesis work. I've seen firsthand how things can quickly change for birds, and how the disappearance of birds from their habitat is an early warning signal that something just isn't right. I know that by protecting birds and the places they need, we will be protecting each other as well. By rooting our work in science, we can leverage our expertise in policy and grassroots strength to act fast on climate for birds and for people. Our panel today features experts working every day to advance climate solutions for birds. You're going to hear from members of our policy, science, conservation, and government affairs teams about how they approach their work every day. Today, we'll be focused on a part of Audubon's climate work, and I hope you sign up and join us for our efforts to protect birds and all of our climate solutions moving forward. Our interim Chief Conservation Officer, Marshall Johnson, is going to introduce and moderate our panel. We'll have some time reserved at the end of our presentation for questions. So please don't hesitate to put questions in the Zoom chat and also in our Facebook Live page. We'll do our best to answer as many of these as we can. So with that, Marshall, I would like to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. And might I add, thank you for your leadership. It is so amazing to have such a experienced, dedicated bird conservationist and climate scientists leading the Audubon movement at this moment. Thank you all for being with us today. I'm really looking forward to the discussions that we will have. Again, my name is Marshall Johnson. I have the honor of serving as the acting Chief Conservation Officer of the National Audubon Society. I'm joining you today from the Prairie Pothole region, the duck factory, if you will, right here in Fargo, North Dakota. Some of the best solutions to reducing carbon emissions are found in these landscapes, natural landscapes that actively clean our air, water, and naturally store carbon, putting that carbon to work, building vegetation and habitat for birds and other wildlife, and keeping that carbon out of the atmosphere. These landscapes, including forests, wetlands, grasslands, and rangelands, also provide benefits to people like cooling our cities, mitigating floods, and protecting coastal communities, and providing clean drinking water to us all. Our panelists today, as Dr. Gray alluded to, work across the Audubon network to advance natural solutions every part of the hemisphere. I want you all to give them a hand as we welcome each of our talented panelists. Please join me. Dr. Brooke Bateman, Director, Climate Science, joining us from Long Island, New York. Dr. Melinda Sepp, our Vice President for Working Lands and Natural Solutions, joining us from Washington, D.C. Dr. Pelayo Alvarez, Audubon, California Conservation Ranching Program Director, joining us from Sacramento, California. And Kristen Murphy, Audubon Great Lakes Government Affairs Associate, joining us from the Windy City, Chicago. Thank you all for joining us. I, again, want to make the most of our time together, so let's dive right in. I've got a couple of questions. I want to go to you first, Brooke. Can you tell us about some of the key takeaways from the Natural Climate Solutions Report?
Yeah, thank you, Marshall, and happy to be here. So as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, our Survive by Degrees report mentioned that 2/3 of birds are at risk of extinction from climate change. So this really sounded the alarm that climate change is something that we need to really care about for both people and for birds. Our Natural Climate Solutions report provides a scientific framework forward to help us address this threat for both the biodiversity and the climate change crisis. So we looked at the available toolkit of natural climate solutions that naturally store carbon in the ground, capturing it in plants, that can really draw down carbon from the atmosphere and help us mitigate climate change. So as Marshall mentioned, we looked at forests, grasslands, arid lands, coastal and interior wetlands, rangelands, tundra systems, as well as urban and suburban ecosystems. We found what is good for birds is often good for climate change mitigation. There was a lot of these areas that overlapped for areas that are important for birds now and into the future as they have to shift their ranges with climate change, that also naturally store a lot of carbon currently in the atmosphere and have the ability to pull more carbon. So we looked at areas that we prioritize for maintaining. That means areas that we want to really focus on protection and sustainable management practices because they're doing a really good job of providing habitat for birds and currently storing a lot of carbon. And we also identified areas that are important for restoration. These areas have a lot of human modification. They've been changed from their natural state, but they have the potential to store a lot more carbon than they currently are and help us in this climate change drawdown and stabilization that we're looking towards. So combine these areas that we identified in the report, store over 100 billion tons of carbon currently. And if we can minimize some of this disturbance and restore these habitats, they have the potential to sequester, which means pull carbon out of the atmosphere, up to twice as much carbon as they are currently, while also improving bird habitat. And so as Elizabeth mentioned, this can contribute up to 23% of our commitment to the Paris Agreement, while at the same time building resilience into our habitats that will benefit both birds and people. So it really is a win-win on this, as I mentioned, this dual crisis of climate and biodiversity that we need to work towards now.
Thank you, Brooke. I really appreciate that. Sometimes this topic and these discussions related to our planet, to the future of our climate, can feel overwhelming. Kristen, I want to come to you and ask, can you talk with us about how you connect this to grassroots action? What can we as individuals do? What should we be doing?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question, Marshall. And again, my name is Kristen Murphy. I'm the Government Affairs Associate for Audubon Great Lakes, and I'm in Chicago, Illinois. Just for some background, Audubon Great Lakes is a regional office of the National Audubon Society, and we are focusing on protecting birds and the places they need across 5 states in the Great Lakes region. And so that includes Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. We're doing on-the-ground work to advance natural climate solutions. We are doing conservation work, we're doing wetland restoration work, and we actually recently released a report that I think will be dropped in the chat. It's called Audubon's Vision, Restoring the Great Lakes for Birds and People, and that details some of our restoration work across the region. And in addition, our policy work at the state and federal level is actively engaging decision makers across the political spectrum. And we also have over 200,000 Audubon members and over 50 chapters across the region. I think I saw Peoria Audubon in the chat, and I'm sure there's others. So shout out to our great chapters in our region who help us advocate for climate change solutions. So this unique confluence of conservation, policy, and advocacy really help bring all hands on deck, which is what we need right now to fight climate change. So as you've heard, climate change is the greatest threat to birds and people. And we know that climate change is disproportionately impacting communities of color, and it can feel really overwhelming, like you mentioned, Marshall. But I'm really inspired by the progress that I've seen in our region on policy solutions that address climate change, and as well as the collective power that grassroots organizing has. And so while climate change is a global problem, there are a lot of opportunities for people to get involved in this grassroots action. So you don't have to be an expert you don't have to be a climate expert to take action. Legislators actually really want to hear from real people who are their constituents. And the more that legislators hear about a particular issue, the more likely they are to prioritize that issue. And they might even potentially become champions on that issue. They really do want to know what is impacting their constituents. They want to know what their constituents care about, and they want to hear about these potential solutions. And so that's why at Audubon Great Lakes and across the country, we're working with our Audubon chapters and members to help them uplift their voices on important issues like climate change. And I think it's important to know too that you as individuals, your most powerful asset is your storytelling ability. Legislators are going to remember those personal connections about why you care about birds, why you care about climate change. And that's going to be what sticks in their head over facts and figures and data. So, some ways that we help do this, some ways that you can do this right now is you can find action alerts on our website that will email your legislators about issues you care about. You can call your legislators. You can write letters to the editor and op-eds in local newspapers. You can post on social media, and you can even schedule meetings with your legislators to let them know about the issues that you care about, like climate change. And so meeting with your legislators can even happen in a couple different ways. There are often lobby days that are happening. You can schedule a meeting with them, or you can even think creatively. We often actually invite legislators out on bird walks, which is a very fun way to connect about issues like climate change. So organizations like Audubon are providing education on policies and creating a variety of opportunities for people like you to take meaningful climate action. So no matter where you're from, what occupation you're in, you have an opportunity to influence climate action.
Thank you, Kristen. I've always appreciated how comprehensive the Audubon Great Lakes team takes to this work and mobilizing 200,000 plus grassroots members in an assortment of different ways, whether it's out burning, habitat and wetland restoration, and are engaging the community. Thank you. I want to jump across the continental US to California and bring in Pelayo. Pelayo, how does this impact your discussions and outreach with potential partners in California?
So yes, Pelayo Alvarez, I'm the director for California for Audubon's Conservation Ranching Initiative. So we work with ranchers to provide market incentives for them to manage their land in a way that provides protects bird habitat, but also improves overall rangeland health, including carbon sequestration and better water cycling. So, climate change we used to have talk about climate change in the abstract, but now in the West we have drought and we have fires, and so then it's just starting to become real. So conversations with our partners are about what can we do to help ranchers mitigate drought, what can we do to position them to maybe provide grazing services to reduce field loads. So it's moving from just an abstract conversation about climate change to a real conversation about what can we actually do to keep protecting these rangeland habitats, in turn protecting bird habitats, increase carbon sequestration, protect our watersheds. So that those are the conversations. Also, we saw an increase in interest in soil health, which is probably one of the best things that ranchers can do to mitigate climate change, is work on improving soil health to be able to capture not only more carbon, but also more water. So there's a lot of interest in the state about incentive programs for healthy soils, a lot of events, workshops, a lot of outreach to ranchers. Again, a lot of focus on healthy soils.
Thank you, Pelayo. Now, personally, I could talk about grasslands all day long, and it's such an important landscape for us to enhance and protect, given the role that it plays in sequestering carbon. But I want to come back over to Brooke. And Brooke, can you speak to the importance of forests and wetlands to both natural solutions and birds?
Yeah, definitely. So I do want to reiterate what Marshall just said. Our grasslands, our other ecosystems are really important in terms of natural climate solutions. Even our urban and suburban communities can play a really important part. And you can check out all of the information of the different types of natural climate solutions that benefit both birds and carbon and climate change stabilization at our natural climate solutions report. But I do want to highlight these two ecosystems really quickly. So forests are one of our most important ecosystems for birds. Up to 1/3 of our migratory birds depend on forests at some point during the year. And it's also home to one of our most climate vulnerable groups of birds. They're really at risk to climate change, large amounts of range loss, as we saw in our Survival by Degrees reports. And so we really want to figure out the best way to protect, maintain, and restore our forest ecosystems to help with the biodiversity component. But it also represents the biggest opportunity for carbon storage. And so forests store a lot of carbon in their plants, in the soils, and in the dead matter in forests themselves. They have the largest storage capacity of carbon across any ecosystem in the US. There's a large amount of forests. There's a lot of opportunity here. And they also actively sequester more carbon, which means they pull more carbon out of the atmosphere into their living plants, into the soils I mentioned, more than any other habitat type. And so because of this sort of dual nature that they're really important for birds, migratory birds, for climate vulnerable birds, but also provide this huge opportunity to take action on climate change, we need to focus on forests in a big way. So reforestation is one opportunity. We've lost a lot of forests. It will provide successional forest habitat for species like the American woodcock and the wood thrush. Wood thrush is one of those species. We've lost 6 in 10 wood thrush over the last 50 years, which we realize that we've lost 3 billion birds. These are forest birds are part of this. And so if we can restore some of these areas, we can really improve that habitat for those species. And also protection of old growth and more established forests, we can really help species like the spotted owl and the black-throated blue warbler. On the other hand, wetlands don't really cover a large majority of the United States. We have interior wetlands and coastal wetlands. But I will say that there are large amounts of carbon that can be stored in these ecosystems, transferred into that rich organic soil that's held in the roots of plants. It's often called blue carbon. And this carbon can remain in that ecosystem for thousands of years. So it really is a long-term mitigation plan. And despite their limited area, they actually store the highest amount of carbon per acre. And so they really pack like a really big bang for their buck in the amount of work that can be done. A lot of our wetlands have been modified. They've experienced a lot of urbanization or changes due to human modification, although they're really important for birds like waterfowl, hawks, and shorebirds. Endangered species like the piping plover, as well as salt marsh sparrows, they're all rely on wetlands at certain times of the year. And so really focusing on how we can restore a lot of these habitats for these birds moving forward is going to help move the needle on climate change and provide resilience for these species and for people alike. I mean, if you restore wetlands, especially coastal wetlands, you're helping to mitigate some of those flood issues associated with increased storms, with sea level rise. And so it's really another one of these win-win situations where if we focus on improving these habitats and protecting them, we can really make a difference.
Thank you, Brooke. That's really important. You know, I want to call out something from the report, which really caught my eye as someone who spent a lot of time working with private landowners. The majority of the priority areas that we're targeting are privately owned. And so we work with farmers, ranchers, other landowners. But the number wasn't 99%, right? So there still leaves a substantial amount of land that is in the public ownership. Melinda, I want to come to you and ask you, how do public lands connect to this work?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Marshall. You know, I come back to reminding myself that, you know, it's really important that we acknowledge there are different types of landowners and land managers as we think about how to partner with an eye to impact and outcomes in the field. We know that birds rely on landscapes across flyways, whether they are public or private land. So it's important that we collaborate across that same map. Like Brooke mentioned, 2/3 of these priority areas to maintain and restore in the US are privately owned, but that means that we've got a full 1/3 that are public land. To lift up a specific example here that I find pretty illustrative and helpful, just to look specifically at Alaska, priority areas in Alaska store the second highest amount of carbon per acre, with nearly half of that total acreage footprint comprised of forest. And the majority of those priority areas in Alaska are public lands. The Tongass National Forest in Alaska represents 44% of the total carbon mitigation capacity of the entire national forest and grassland system in the US. One national forest in the state of Alaska. So those public landscapes certainly look different across the country, right? They are forests, they're grasslands, they're rangelands, they're arid lands like sagebrush, coastal wetlands, interior wetlands, and even those urban and suburban areas. This highlights the importance of working locally with public land managers to support restoration and enhancement of native habitats and also appropriate maintenance of those habitats. And it also means that we can support funding for the work that needs to be done in those landscapes. That work also looks different in different landscapes, right? It includes work to avoid the conversion of native grasslands, to restore degraded grasslands and shrublands, to reduce invasive species like cheatgrass, which competes with native perennial plants and fundamentally changes the landscape in a way that impacts birds and carbon storage potential. It also includes supporting management strategies like appropriate grazing. And the really exciting thing I think about a lot of those public land opportunities are those are both national, state, and local. There's an opportunity to engage at multiple points and in multiple ways across each of those landscapes and each of those public lands, whether it's a land management plan, public meetings and feedback on land management plans. There are ways to support that kind of ladder of opportunity for folks, and folks can meet the land managers where they are. So thanks for the question, Marshall.
Thank you. Wow, that's sort of a statistic that you never forget, right? About Alaska and our public forests and the opportunities to influence outcomes on land that are held in the public trust. But you tossed up a softball for me, so let's come back to grasslands, because again, I'm a nut for grasslands and their potential to be a real solution in this. I want to come back to Palaio really quickly. The 3 billion birds report showed that of all of our bird species, none have been lost at a higher rate than grassland birds. And we know a significant amount of grassland bird habitat exists on private land. And we also know that climate change could be a death knell for these species that are already on the brink. How does conservation ranching support birds, climate, and climate resilience?
So I think that the important link here is avoided conversion. Is by working on market incentives, keeping ranchers ranching, allowing them to increase their profit margins, allows them to keep their ranches and therefore keep providing habitat for birds. At the same time, as the other panelists were saying, grasslands are sequestering carbon. So just by protecting the land that we have and the land use that we have right now as ranching, again, because it's providing good bird habitat that could be improved, and it provides carbon sequestration that also could be increased, is this idea of curbing that trend of converting those rangelands to other uses like intensive agriculture or urban development that also have less potential for climate benefits, but also higher emissions. So again, you have this double goal of keeping the habitat and keeping the ability to mitigate and adapt to climate change, but just protecting the land use. At the same time, since we're engaging directly with ranchers, we can actually improve on their management, by providing these protocols for better management of the habitat. We can actually, and as the science progresses, if we have new and innovative ways of sequestering more carbon, we could, again, as we engage the ranchers, we could bring those ideas and innovations to them as well. One thing that our protocols are emphasizing is diversity, and more diverse grasslands not only provide more diverse habitat for birds, but also provide more carbon sequestration. So by providing more or trying to improve the diversity of our grasslands, we again keep that dual goal of bird habitat and climate change.
Thank you, Palaio. And we enrolled 3.5 million acres in the conservation ranching program, and thinking about conservation ranching across so many more million acres, we can do so much good for birds in avoiding conversion of grasslands, as well as increasing the ability of grasslands to sequester carbon. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. And a common theme throughout our conversation already are the different people, the different communities that can make an impact through the Audubon movement and through the work that we're doing in an effort to save our planet and save our climate. I think that is sort of a theme that's resonated with me. In keeping with that, I want to come back to Kristen. How have you used specifically grassroots action to tackle climate change solutions in the Great Lakes region?
Yeah, sure. I could talk about that for days, but the Audubon Great Lakes region is unique. We have 5 states, like I mentioned, that span the range of political ideologies across the spectrum. And so the reality is we need states in the Midwest to help win on advancing climate policy. And we also need a wide variety of solutions. So not every strategy is going to look the same in each state. So I have two examples. I narrowed it down, even though we have so many, that are on opposite ends of the political spectrum, where we used grassroots action to advocate for climate change policy solutions. So the first one that I want to talk about is in Indiana, which, as you may know, is a more red state. And we've actually identified opportunities to work with Republicans on climate through a federal bill that's called the Growing Climate Solutions Act. This is a bill that's championed by Hoosier legislators, and it incentivizes farmers, foresters, and ranchers to implement climate-friendly practices on their land. And as I'm sure you know too, Indiana is a highly agricultural state. So this is just a piece of the puzzle towards addressing climate change. And we think this bill is really important because nature-based solutions, examples of which include many of the things we've talked about, but cover crops, prescribed grazing, reforestation, can provide up to 37% of the emissions reductions that are needed to protect these birds that are threatened by climate change. So to build support for this legislation in Indiana, we worked with Audubon members to help them submit letters to the editor. We have an Indiana University student chapter who helped us phone bank. They would call Audubon members and ask them to call their legislators to support this bill. And we also worked with chapters and partners to organize bird walks with members on both sides of the aisle. So we were really excited that this bill passed through the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support. And we're still asking House members to co-sponsor. And we'll really use this as a foundation to continue to push legislators in Indiana and across the country to support and champion climate policies. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Illinois, which is a very blue state. Audubon Great Lakes and its members mobilized in support of a clean energy bill in Illinois. So we had our membership send more than 4,600 letters asking their Illinois legislators to pass comprehensive clean energy legislation. We had over 100 Audubon members who registered to attend 5 lobby days over the past 3 years. Some of them were in person, more recently they've been virtual. And because of all of this great action, we actually very recently celebrated a major victory in Illinois when the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act was signed into law very recently, earlier this month. So we were part of a massive coalition of stakeholders. It was not just environmental groups, it was healthcare professionals, it was faith-based organizations, it was student groups, all who came together and were pushing for climate change across the state. And it's really because of this powerful group of different voices from a variety of sectors that Illinois has passed the most equitable clean energy jobs bill of its kind in the nation. So we have a press release. If you're curious to learn more about this bill, we're going to go ahead and drop that in the chat as well. And so I think it just goes to show that all this collective action, all this grassroots advocacy, it can be extremely powerful, and it's a really important part of addressing climate change.
Kristen, I think that's really what's so magical, if you will, about the Audubon movement, is that we're local everywhere, and we can bring those diverse voices together around an issue. Really appreciate all of your great work, and kudos and a gold star for having the grassland bird. I want to bring Dr. Gray back into the discussion, for everyone, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat box. I want to open it up to comments that we've already received, or questions that we've already received in the chat box, and broaden this discussion a little bit and put our panelists on the hot seat a little bit. I want to come to you first, Dr. Gray. We've talked a bit about it already, but why does Audubon work on climate?
Yeah, it's a great question, Marshall. It's a question a lot of people ask. So in just my lifetime, we've lost 3 billion birds. And to me, that is just so striking. And so when we released our science reports in 2014, but then again in 2019, the Survival by Degrees report, learning that 2/3 of remaining North American birds are at risk of extinction for climate change just sent chills down my spine. And we also know that if we take action on climate, 3/4 of those birds can reduce the risk of extinction, those species that are at risk. So we have to tackle the most important threat to birds and their habitat that they rely on. And we know that that threat is climate change. So without that, we risk losing the birds that we love. And the reason that we support the National Audubon Society and all our affiliated chapters and support our partners. So it's essential. If you care about birds, you should care about climate. And that's why the National Audubon Society tackles climate. And I'll also share one more thing. We spent most of this panel talking about natural climate solutions, which is an incredibly important body of work that the National Audubon Society engages in. We've also touched a bit on our climate adaptation and using natural infrastructure to build resiliency, which also creates habitat for birds and protects communities. And Audubon works on, as Kristen mentioned, deploying renewable energy and clean energy innovation. And so we really have this 4-pillared approach. It's important, it's comprehensive. You have to look at a suite of strategies. As I mentioned earlier, this is a complex problem. It's going to require a suite of strategies. And because we will only have birds if we tackle climate, this is why National Audubon Society is devoting a lot of time and attention to this topic.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And you sold me. I think you've sold a lot of bird lovers out there, and I'm proud to be a part of this movement that is bringing all of Audubon to bear in this fight. Pelayo, a question from the audience to you. How do you find partners for your work? You mentioned ranchers and urban communities and landowners. How do you find your partners?
Well, again, as we keep talking about rangelands and how important they are, there are others like state agencies, federal agencies that have been doing work on rangelands or are doing work on improving wildlife habitat. So those, it's even organizations, conservation organizations, and agencies that are interested in water. That's another ecosystem service we didn't bring up. But so that trifecta of carbon, wildlife, and water, anyone here in the state of California who is interested in protecting those should be interested in protecting rangelands, right? And also in how they're managed. So we've been doing a lot of work over the years to, again, raise the profile of rangelands as providers of ecosystem services. And so people are aware and they're coming to the space and trying to come up with creative solutions to, again, keep rangelands intact and keep managing them for all those ecosystem services that we all care about.
Thank you. Thank you. Brooke, a question for you from Judith. Judith says she can vividly remember joining the Junior Audubon Club and getting my pen when I was in the 4th grade through our class in Richmond, Virginia. I am presently 80 years old. Is there outreach to kids through schools now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I personally have a 7-year-old daughter, and she knows all about the work that I do and is she actually wore her birds say it's time to act on climate shirt to school today. So I know that there are a lot of opportunities, and the Audubon Works program has some particular great resources on the web, and maybe we can grab the link for that for some of the resources that they've worked on, working with some of the online resources. We also have fantastic programs in our chapters and our centers that are directly working with kids on the ground, teaching them about the work that we're doing, Survival by Degrees. There's a kind of a great tool out there where you can share with children what birds are going to potentially be at risk in your state or your zip code. I think that might have been dropped in the chat earlier. So there's a lot of opportunities to introduce the idea of climate change to kids. I think one of the things that I really think I want to take a step back from is that climate change is a really abstract concept. It's something like, what does 3 degrees global warming mean? Is this just about like polar bears? I think birds are a really unique lens for us to see climate change in action. And we have this hashtag birds tell us for a reason. It's because we see them every day. They're everywhere. We connect with them. They kind of relate us to our sense of place and seasons. And so we can see when they're not showing up anymore. And many of our states are actually going to lose their state birds due to climate change if we don't do anything. So I think, yes, we are doing stuff with children, but I also think there's a lot of opportunities to use birds as an education medium about climate change, because it really localizes it and personalizes it and just makes it just a little bit more tangible. So I love that you're still birding from 4th grade to 80. My grandmother was an ornithologist, and she instilled that in me really young. So hopefully we'll continue to do that with our kids, because they're the climate champions for tomorrow, right? So great question.
Thank you, Brooke, and you're absolutely right. I'm here in North Dakota. Our state bird is the meadowlark, and the populations are plummeting, and we have to do right by the meadowlarks, and that it starts with grasslands, it starts with advocacy, and it starts with engaging people at a very young age. So Judith, thanks for your question, and Brooke, thanks for your answer. I want to come to Kristen. You mentioned earlier that arranging a meeting with your local legislator is a great way to get them to take action on climate change. Can you give us an example of what this looks like and talk about why it's so effective?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as I alluded to, bringing a legislator out on a bird walk has been one of the most powerful tools that we've had to connect with decision makers and really visually show them the impact that climate change is having, the impact that land management is having on birds, on the habitat we're in, and it's in their district. It's very relatable. So we've done a couple of, actually many really great bird walks with legislators that have set the foundation for our relationship with their office and changed the trajectory of issues we're working with them on. So one really great example that happened recently was we met with a congressman. We brought him out to a local park in his district. And it was a location where we had like the most perfect confluence of all of Audubon's priorities. So we had on the ground conservation work happening to restore habitat in that area. We had community engagement. So we have a really great community engagement program in our region that's called Wild Indigo. And it is engaging on the ground in communities, especially underserved communities, and showing them the nature that's right in their town, that's right in their backyard. And then we also had some really great advocacy priorities to talk about. So it brought together all of the best parts of Audubon to really show that, your district matters in this fight against climate change, and you have the power to help change it. And here's a great day in a park where you can actually visually see that and look at birds, about the things people care about. And it was a great opportunity to tell personal stories. We had our local chapter there who was there to share the work the chapter was doing and share the people that love birds in that area. So that was just one bird walk we did. We had another bird walk with a congresswoman who turned out to be an avid birder. We didn't really know how passionate she was about birds until we brought her out, and she loved sharing her birding stories with us. And so now that developed a really great relationship with her office, where we're working together and talking about solutions to protect the birds that she loves. And then very recently, we had one last bird walk with a congressman, and we talked to him about the Growing Climate Solutions Act and how important it is for birds in his area. And he actually signed on as a co-sponsor shortly after the walk, like 5 days later. Like that was a direct, we did a bird walk, and the thing we asked happened, which doesn't always happen, but I think those can be really powerful moments and learning opportunities for the legislators, and that sticks with them. They'll remember those bird walks for a long time to come when they're talking about legislation and working on issues. It will spring to their mind, and that is very powerful.
Thank you, Kristen. I want to stick with you because You know, what you're describing is so impactful. It's so empowering for individuals. I've been a part of visiting legislators with landowners, and they walk away feeling like they've made a difference. They feel empowered, and then they want to get other neighbors involved. What can we do to encourage our neighbors and others to participate and support this meaningful work?
Yeah, I think people they get nervous when they hear about talking to legislators. It can sound scary. People don't know what it means, but I think Audubon is doing a great job, and many other organizations are making it really easy to take actions. We have online forms that we call action alerts, and you can just fill those out, and it's 5 minutes to send an email to your legislator to let them know that you care about an issue like climate change. And that is a super easy way to take action. Legislators see those emails, they take note of how many emails they get on a particular issue. And if they're like, wow, we're hearing a lot about this particular bill, maybe we need to look into it and think about where, should we be prioritizing it? How can we be uplifting this thing that my constituents care about? I think once you kind of make the connections about how your individual impact, when it's part of a collective grassroots action with many others, can influence decision-making, that's very empowering to me, at least. And I think that argument may be empowering to a neighbor who's not really sure how they fit into the puzzle, but want to get involved. There are little things like sending an email or making a call. And then there are big things like a bird walk with a legislator, and you can just find something in between that you are able to help out with, and that still makes an impact.
Thank you, Kristen. I want to come really quickly. I just saw this question, and I want to lift it up. Melinda, we've heard a lot about ranchers today. But what about farmers and other working lands? How does Audubon work with other landowners?
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. So mindful of time, I think what I might do is just say, I'm going to acknowledge that we've already talked a bit about public lands, and kind of, I'm not leaving them out. I'm acknowledging and affirming that those are land managers, but I'm going to set them aside for this specific component. There's just some really big statistics that I want to come back to here, right? When Brooke spoke about the priority areas that have very real opportunity to support birds and carbon and climate, 2/3 of those are privately owned. And that just underscores the value in working to support voluntary conservation on private lands, right? How can we help partner with landowners? How can we help support markets that send durable signals to invest in those conservation strategies? How can we reduce some of the risk of innovating and piloting some of those voluntary conservation standards? How can we support kind of that layering, right? Sometimes there are, and Pelayo spoke a bit, sometimes there are really great state initiatives and state programs that are being designed with an eye to voluntary conservation on private lands, whether that's soil health, whether it's specific to carbon. In some states, it might be water quality, water quantity. As someone who grew up in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, that's certainly been an important part of the conversation, but often those practices have significant co-benefits, and we might be talking about a lot of the same practices. So I think being mindful and respectful of all of that, national and state and regional Audubon folks really invest a lot of time and energy in collaborating with partners with an eye to what do they need to be supported at implementing those practices at a scale that's impactful, right? And that's part of why, for folks who may already be signed up for the Audubon Action Alerts, you may have received an alert from us asking that you contact your national policymakers and ask them to support additional investments in Farm Bill voluntary conservation programs. That is a specific ask for us at the national level that is informed and with an eye to this exact type of scenario from Marshall. It's certainly not the only one. And it also, the great thing about a lot of those national programs is that they allow for some state and more local kind of led implementation in a way that can then be more flexible based on the specific conservation challenges in an ecosystem and in a state or even in a county. You know, when we talk about things nationally, we then kind of go to the state, but you know, even within a state, one county can be so dramatically different from a soil and habitat than 2 counties north, let alone 3 counties east, right? Like there's just a good amount of variation, and we certainly want to help support reducing the barriers and making those practices easier to adopt at scale in different habitats.
Thank you, Melinda. You know, what I love about this conversation, despite how big this topic is and how daunting the challenge, what I love about our conversation over the last hour has been what we can do, whether it's the food that we choose or our public lands. It's really positive. So I want to come back. Again, want to thank our panelists and thank all of you for being with us. But I want to hand it back off to Melinda to bring us home with what you can do to advance this work to save our climate and planet.
Thanks, Marshall. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I appreciate this week is an incredibly busy time for a lot of folks for a whole host of reasons. And it was incredible to see such a strong participation for this panel and this specific conversation. So thank you. And I want to come back and kind of just ground this closing in a few observations, right? One, the science tells us that 2/3 of North American bird species are at risk of extinction from climate change. 2, the science also tells us it is not too late. We don't have to be paralyzed by that statistic. We can take specific steps to stabilize our climate. 3, it also tells us that acting now helps improve the chances for 3/4 of those at-risk bird species, right? Like I'm getting goosebumps, right? Those are just, wow. So I want to acknowledge that a lot of folks sent a chat kind of getting to Marshall's question, you know, what do we do with this information? How can we help? So I'm going to shift my plans up a little bit because I actually feel pretty strongly that what we can do is act together and know that our actions ladder up to support both each other and the birds that we are all working on behalf of. That's part of Audubon's mission, right? That's why we're here. And that's why we're all collaborating, both internal, right, kind of within the Audubon partnership and with our external partners in the field, folks like the ranchers that Pelayo talks with and works with, folks like the legislators that Kristen spoke about the bird walk with. So I also just want to give a few examples of how that work might look, not because they are exhaustive or comprehensive, but because sometimes that like concrete example is just helpful. So I think that work can look, you know, just depending on where you are, it's ranging from providing feedback on a specific land management plan. I've seen some chats from folks with some hyper local, just like in your community examples. Great, that's an action that is laddering up and supporting what we're talking about today. It might be providing feedback on state, on local, and even on national budgets that invest in public land management. So public land managers have the resources they need to manage the land in a way that supports kind of the priority areas and impacts that Brooke told us about. It might be speaking on those same budgets as they invest in voluntary conservation on private lands, coming back to that Audubon ask you may have already been asked to participate in. And it might look like supporting durable market signals, right? Like the work that Pelayo and the Conservation Ranching Initiative is supporting, or the work that's happening in places like Vermont through the Maple Syrup Initiative. So I want to connect all of those when I think about the examples that Kristen gave us of how we can work together through grassroots action and how that collective action can be powerful. Because we want to be here as a resource to help you when you ask, what can I do? And give you specific, here's what you can do examples. So please sign up today, sign our climate pledge to join the flock. The link is in the Zoom chat or in the Facebook comment section, depending on how you're joining us. And sign up now, we will send you ways to help, and we hope to see you again soon.